Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, it's been a hot minute since I had the lovely opportunity to just sit down with you all and talk about Monster Hunter for a little bit. I miss our time together, and so of course I'm gonna come right back at you with something that will probably make a bunch of people a little bit upset, but I'm a little goblin, so that's okay. But mostly I just want to talk about the weapons of Monster Hunter, including ones as part of the spin-off games, and I figured it would be fun to do so in a tier list format. The main reason for this is, well, with Monster Hunter 6 potentially being on the near horizon, everyone is hoping for an actual announcement for news for this at some point in the near future, and one of the biggest things that could potentially and possibly even likely be a part of that new generation of monster hunting is the addition of a brand new weapon type. We always ask for them every time there's a new Monster Hunter game, and this is probably the best time for them to do it with the start of the 6th generation, and it'll be the best time for them to do it for the next few years. So chances are at least decent that this could be happening, and so I figured we should all talk about what we do and don't like about each of the various weapons in the series already, the gameplay philosophies that we think are fun versus the ones that aren't fun, and so of course this is not a definitive objective tier list by any means. This is just my favorite weapons. Some of them are weighted more for moveset, some of them more for the pure concept being cool, some of them for being consistently enjoyable across multiple games, whereas others change a lot between the games but have one very fun version of themselves. And the idea of this is, hey, put your own opinions down in the comments too down below, and if we get enough of a sample size here, we might even be able to show Capcom what the players will actually want from a new weapon. Without further ado then, here is the blank tier list. I have an F tier on here, but no, it's not ever going to be used here. It's just an example for the sake of saying, hey, no Monster Hunter weapon ever has been an F tier video game weapons by any means. They all have their own beautiful niche of playstyle fantasy, so this tier exists, but I will be keeping it empty. And keep in mind, this is the weapons ranked against each other, so even the worst one isn't F tier for a reason. And on that note, in the D tier, I have placed, well, the Lance. There are various points at which I have enjoyed playing Lance for one reason or another, but it's always been a very fleeting enjoyment, a very short period of time, a sort of novelty or gimmick. Something like being a purposeful tank in Fatalis or in Behemoth in base world, where I would just live as a turtle and try to help my team out as a result in multiplayer. But I have never really enjoyed Lance as a solo hunting weapon. It is slow, and yes, it gets consistent damage out from a safe position, which is great, but I just don't really find it that fun in its current incarnation. It's almost like the rhythm game of Monster Hunter, where you just put yourself in the right spot beside the monster, then guard or poke depending on the animation the monster does, and that's pretty much perfect gameplay. There's nothing wrong with that, really. I just like a bit of a faster pace personally. Past that, going up to the C tier, and I'm just going to be totally transparent about what I'm doing here. I am putting both the light bowgun and the heavy bowgun in the C tier. These are the only weapons in the C tier, but I'm putting both of them here, and I'm going to talk about them at the same time. And while I am well aware that there are a load of people who do love the bowguns and honestly don't even really want to play other weapons, I think that in itself says a lot, because the concept of being properly ranged in Monster Hunter is very unusual compared to the other weapons. Even bow plays a lot more like a melee weapon than the bowguns do. The bowguns are just so radically different in playstyle to the other weapons that it almost feels like a whole other game when you're playing them, but they also feel very similar to each other. They're very polarizing. You either like that style of gameplay or you don't, and while I do dabble in bowguns from time to time to keep things fresh, I could never see myself maining one for a prolonged period of time, which to me is the line that keeps a weapon in C tier over being in our next tier, which is B. This is essentially the average grouping in my mind. The weapons I think are solid, and I enjoy mixing it up with sometimes. I have sets for usually and everything like that, but I couldn't see myself maining these for an entire game. First here is, interestingly enough, actually the medium bowgun, which is from Monster Hunter Tri. This is, more than anything, just to make a sort of point, which is that I think honestly, heavy and light bowgun should go back to being compacted into a single weapon type like they were in Tri, the medium bowgun. Give certain monster trees different interactions, like attach Wyvern Fire to a Devil Joe weapon, or the counter mines to Rajang. And then here comes the fun part, bowgun mods. Instead of just having it so some bowgun mods only work for light bowgun, and some only work for heavy bowgun, how about we just have it so the bowgun mods decide if your bowgun is heavy or light. A bowgun with no mods is light, a bowgun with either a lot of mods or just some high weight mods like a shield will turn into a heavy bowgun as a result, and it gets less wieldy, it gets a little bit harder to move around, it gets a bit higher recoil the heavier the gun gets. Just literally work in a weight function to these weapons, and then you could have it just be one weapon with different modifications. Then the players properly get full customization over a bowgun itself. They don't have to double make to be a double bowgun player, and not only would this let players have a more interesting time with the weapon, it would also condense the assets that the developers need to use to actually even create these things. And I just think that would be a more fun way to have this weapon exist, but also give more space for new ranged weapons to exist one day in the future. The second weapon in this tier is not technically a weapon, it is Prowler mode from Generations. And honestly, I think this is pretty cool. It was a fun concept that I enjoyed playing a little bit in Generations Ultimate, but it just wasn't as fleshed out as a proper weapon and a proper hunting gameplay style. Really doesn't feel like being a hunter. Yes, there were a lot of little bits bits of it that made it a bit more complex because it was based off the palette code, so there was a lot to actually think about when creating your Prowler, but it just didn't feel in combat how I want Monster Hunter to feel. It's definitely a concept I would be happy to see again in the future though, with a good bit of reworking on the actual moment-to-moment gameplay. After that we have the Accel axe, which comes from Monster Hunter Explore, and well, it's essentially just a hammer-sized axe with rocket boosters on the back, like the rocket-powered greatsword! And this is just a neat concept for a weapon. I like the idea of it, and of course the moveset is limited by it being in the Monster Hunter Explorer game, but while I like the look of it in its natural environment, I think I'm happy for this one not to come to the main series, at least not in its current state without a lot of changes, because honestly, to me, this weapon is just sort of hammer and gunlance smushed together, just putting the hammer visuals and shape and size and even hitbox, but then given the movement utility of gunlance shells, which is fun, but it's essentially just something that we already have between those two weapons, and I would just rather have something else entirely, something that is extremely different, essentially. Then we have the switch axe. I do enjoy myself a good bit of switch axing, I've got multiple builds for it, but I tend to find it a bit repetitive if I play it too much. Yes, there are different stages to it, like getting yourself into the powered up mode so you can go into the sword mode, efficient usage of the sword mode, and your morphing attacks as well. There's a lot of nuance to the weapon, but to me when I play switch axe personally, it feels like I'm just blasting off the efficient combos from memory and hoping I connect with the monster, rather than actively hunting and dodging the monster's attacks, reacting to his movements, things like that. Maybe it's just a me thing, but it just doesn't quite vibe with me as much as the things that I've ranked above it. After that, we're going to be having the bow, which I think is much better than the other ranged weapons, which is possibly because it's sort of a mixed ranged melee weapon because there's a lot closer range that you actually have to be successful with the bow, more or less. And this is a weapon that I absolutely adored in World and Iceborne, but never really gelled with in Rise and Sunbreak, or in the pre-5th gen games either. So essentially, I really enjoyed bow for a snapshot in time, a frozen moment, and for the rest of its existence, it's just not really clicked with me. For whatever reason, the World and Iceborne bow's rhythmic movement, the charged dashes, the strong shots after the rapid shots, it was just really enjoyable, and I often felt like a matador dodging out of the way of a bull to then fire arrows into its weak spot. But for whatever reason, with all the silk binds and the switch skills in Rise and Sunbreak, the weapon lost its spark a little bit for me. After that, finishing off the B tier, we have the Insect Glaive, and I have so much to say about this weapon. I'm always very back and forth with this weapon because it is what it is, and that's exactly why it's here. Aerial Insect Glaive is possibly my favorite concept of a playstyle that is currently in the series, in the main series at least. I love the idea of floating around, bouncing off of a monster while dodging it, simply being above the attack rather than having to avoid it on the ground, and just having access to monster parts like wings in a way that no other weapon has. That is super unique, but unfortunately, pure aerial Insect Glaive has never been the strongest way to play that weapon, and has always been notably weaker than the grounded gameplay equivalent. That said, ground Insect Glaive is also fun, it just feels like a different weapon, with the exception of, the whole Kinsect part. Conceptually, Kinsect Friend is fun. I love having an insect, I love having it being a part of your actual moveset and your damage, but let's be real, no one actively enjoys the part of this weapon where you have to collect your buffs with the Kinsect extract once every couple of minutes, or else you get incredibly nerfed. In other words, I enjoy Insect Glaive in small bursts. I enjoy the different playstyles, I absolutely love the concepts behind it, but the high-powered attacks aren't really in the playstyle that I enjoy, and the bug buff maintenance is pretty tedious to me. Moving on to the A tier then, these are all the weapons where if there was for some reason a new Monster Hunter game with only one weapon in it that you were ever allowed to use, I would still have a really good time with it if it was any of these, and probably get thousands of hours in it anyways. Starting off the tier then is actually the Magnet Spike from Monster Hunter Frontier, and well, it's just really hard to explain this weapon to people who haven't played or at least seen what it's like to play endgame Monster Hunter Frontier, and it's really hard to compare it to the other weapons or even imagine it in a main series game, honestly. But essentially, Magnet Spike visually is like this massive glaive connected by a wire that can then transform into a hammer the size of a greatsword. On top of that, it offers the greatest mobility of any weapon in the series, letting you magnetically pull yourself or repel away from a monster part that you've marked pretty much on command, and there are tons of iframes everywhere in the moveset too. To put it simply, for this weapon to come to the main series, it would need to be nerfed such a significant amount, but I think the visuals make for some really unique weapon designs, and I think a really massive weapon that is also high movement because of magnets is a really cool concept, and we've had magneticism brought into the series properly in the main series because of Narwa, so it's always a possibility from this point forward. And generally, I really enjoy using the Magnet Spike in Frontier, and I love the concept of this weapon enough that I'd happily play a heavily nerfed or changed version of it in the main series if it came there. After that, we have the Sword and Shield coming in afterwards, and this weapon is, it's pretty simple, I know, it's just so simple, but is also pretty much equally satisfying and effective at the same time. Overall, it has the lowest commitment time between attacks in the games, meaning that while you're using this, you have the best chance of reacting reacting to a monster attack and then dodging it in time, which just creates a fun feeling of responsiveness unique to the other weapons. Same thing with being able to heal and use items without sheathing. It just makes the weapon feel faster paced in general, and it makes it feel more unique. Given how simplistic its general combos are though, they are still very fun to use, and you still have to work to actually hit weak points on a monster because of the short range of the actual sword. Not to mention Perfect Rush was added in Iceborne, and has since stuck around for the rest of the 5th generation, which if it sticks around in the future, is the perfect big finisher type of moment to cap this weapon off perfectly, so I hope it does stick around. After that we have the Great Sword, and yeah, I know Josh would crucify me for not putting this in the S tier, so if he asks, tell him it's in the F tier. In fact, spam the comments telling him that Great Sword is in the F tier. That way when he actually sees where it is, he'll be relieved instead of angry at me. Honestly, yeah, I just heavily enjoy using this weapon. It is slow, it is difficult to use effectively, and even though on a surface level it's very simple as far as the amount of different attacks, the amount of actual buttons that you press, but there is a lot of practice and nuance to the timing, the positioning, and the aim required to get out your strongest attacks into an actually weak part of the monster and make sure that it actually hits them. That makes it extremely satisfying to use, especially in combination with the really big numbers that it gets. The only reason it's not even higher for me personally is because I have a personal leaning towards using interesting movement mechanics in games, and this, to be blunt, is the least mobile weapon in the series. After that we have the Charge Blade, and this one was definitely an acquired taste for me. When I first played Charge Blade, it was far too complex for me to actually get attached to, but when I actually gave it the proper time to learn it a few months into my time playing Monster Hunter in general, I found something that has a lot of nuance, a lot of thought behind it, and some really just absolutely gorgeous visual results on the screen that are really satisfying when you get the combos right. Sometimes when playing Charge Blade, I have a similar feeling to I do when playing Switch Axe, where I'm focusing less on what the monster is doing than I am on doing the correct combo to fill my files as quickly as possible and then to actually use them effectively. But then there are also plenty more moments with things like guard points and counters on the actual Charge Blade that make it feel much more reactive and actually engaging with the monster rather than just doing your own thing. Not to mention, again, the visual spectacle of this weapon is just an absolute beauty to behold. Then following that is the Longsword. Yeah, I know, make fun of me all you want. I made fun of Longsword users in the past, even after I started playing it. But Longsword is and always has been an incredibly fun weapon in Monster Hunter, in my opinion. There was a period early in the 5th generation where I was actually a Longsword main for a few months and just felt so interestingly unique. The sheer movement and momentum options that Longsword has had with things like Fade Slash, or even the way that your combos would propel you forwards, it just really spoke to me as someone who loves interesting movement in video games. Then of course the satisfaction of hitting a parry only to follow it up with one of the coolest finishers in this series, and even then, Longsword was one of my favorite weapons in earlier generations too, even before Helmbreaker or the parries were even a part of the weapon. It just feels really enjoyable. It's quick but has forgiving range, good movement, fun visual flair, and sound effects too. It's just a really solid weapon for sure. Then rounding off the A tier, finally I actually have the Gunlance going up here, which won't be a surprise to anyone who has followed me for a long time, but may be surprising to those who haven't. But I have a really big soft spot for the Gunlance. I usually don't enjoy it early in a game's life cycle, but once you get to proper endgame, especially end of expansion, Gunlance is one of my favorite things to play because it simply requires less skills to operate at maximum offensive capacity than other weapons do, and endgame Monster Hunter is all about having more space for skills, which means that Gunlance gets to use things like full ranks of evade extender, which is just really fun to move around with backhops, defense boost, evade window, guard skills, a bunch of things like that, and just play like a super speed maniac, but without losing any offensive potency, which any other weapon would have to do to use the same skills, which is just a really enjoyable thing to be able to do to me. Not to mention that conceptually, this is just one of the best weapons in the franchise, at least one of the coolest ones. A lance that is also a cannon, that can also have a mini nuke at short range and also fire out a harpoon just for fun. It's just so cool. It wouldn't feel like Monster Hunter without this weapon around for me at this point. Then finally we have the S tier, and these are quite simply my favorite weapons in the entire series. If I had to swear off ever playing any of the other weapons on this list, I could manage it as long as I still had access to at least one of these ones. Starting off the tier then is the Tonfas from Monster Hunter Frontier, and these are also relatively hard to explain to someone who hasn't played Frontier, but in a more approachable way than the Magnet Spike is. Tonfa is all about momentum and understanding the monster that's in front of you. The weapon itself has two modes that you can swap between, both dealing blunt damage, and long mode is considered the normal mode, but you can also change it to short mode, and what this does is reverse the monster hit zones to blunt damage, by which I mean it makes them act as if you're using a sharp weapon. For example, let's say normally a wing is only a 20 hit zone to blunt, but it's like a 40 hit zone to sharp weapons. Using short modes make this actually count as a 40 hit zone even though you're still doing blunt damage, which makes it actually really strong to hit the monster there with this weapon if you do that. And the fun of that is that short mode also gives you an aerial attack that bounces you back up into the air like Glaive has, so there is aerial mode Tonfas, whereas long mode has a downward slam finisher when you're in the air, so it can't really do that. So the idea of of this is that you have a weapon that has the speed of dual blades, the ability to reverse its strongest hit zones, and the ability to maintain aerial combat to hit unusual parts for a reasonable amount of time. On top of that, as you attack a monster part, it will actually build up a debuff. This will let you do a finisher on that part, which will just do a really cool explosion, and it has its own unique effects, and it's a little bit complex at that point. The weapon, though, is conceptually awesome. It is really fun to play in its own game, and I would honestly be super happy if it came to the main series, even with limited changes. I would love that. After that, in a sort of expected way, is actually going to be dual blades. These are my first main weapon in the series, and while I don't play them as much these days, I have always had a lot of respect for dual blades. When I talk about enjoying movement in video games, usually what I mean is more unique movement, more controlled movement. Things like how longsword attacks carry you a specific distance in certain directions, and how you can use that to position yourself actively while still swinging the weapon. Well, dual blades is a different kind of movement freedom. Demon mode makes you run around super fast, the attack combos have relatively light commitment between them unless you go for the flurry, and between the regular fighting, and the way the attacks feel different between demon mode and non-demon mode is really cool. The fun interactions like the Beyblade down the back are just flashy as all hell, and it feels really cool. And honestly, I've always been a fan of fighting in games where you just see a million cuts in a fraction of a second rather than just one big hit, which just sort of feels right for Monster Hunter in my head. There are only two ends that make the most sense for fighting monsters like this, either death by 1,000 cuts, just a really fast weapon where the idea is that the hunter knows the exact places to do these little cuts to deal the most damage with shallow cuts, or the other side of it, which is things like greatsword or hammer. They're just so big and heavy that they could believably damage something that big, and you may have heard me say its name there, and it's coming up right now, well, the hammer. This became my great love in Iceborne, and it stayed in my main essentially throughout the entirety of the rest of Iceborne, with me only having short breaks away to try out other weapons before inevitably winding back on hammer. Conceptually, it is extremely simple, but it's just a rock on a stick, and they gave it a really fun moveset. So many of them visually are heads on sticks, which I also love. They also let you move while charging the weapon, which I love, and they even made it the only weapon that actually got more fun after Clutch Claw was added to the game in Iceborne, and you can spin off of your own charge attacks. And there's just something so fun about using something as heavy and unwieldy looking to bonk something in the face like this hammer, while still being able to run while charging, while still having the movement that you do, the speed that you do. It gives you the power fantasy of something large and unwieldy while still having the gameplay feel fluid and relatively quick paced. And finally, we have, of course, the only weapon remaining, the hunting horn. I have always loved this weapon. The actual playstyle didn't really gel massively with me before the moveset change-up happened in Monster Hunter Rise, when it stuck with me really well. I absolutely love the way it plays now, even though I know there are people who don't. Who knows if that will stick into the 6th generation, maybe it'll go back to the way it was before, maybe we'll get an entirely new interpretation of Hunting Horn in that gen. But the reason that Hunting Horn takes the spot above else for me is simply the concept of the weapon and the experience. The moveset is cool, and watching someone play Hunting Horn is awesome, just flinging around an instrument, making cool sounds while beating a giant monster to death and buffing everyone around them. The idea of buffing your teammates in this type of game as a sort of a soft support weapon is really fun to me, and I just absolutely cannot get over how the entire animation moveset for the weapon essentially looks like you're just dancing to the music that you're creating while fighting. It's such an inventive concept for a weapon in a game of this style. It is so unique, and it speaks to me so much just on an inner level that there is no way I would ever label this weapon anything other than S tier. And that just about does it then, everyone. Every weapon from the history of the Monster Hunter franchise ranked in a tier list by me. Again, these are my own opinions. I'm sure there will be plenty of disagreement with it, but you know, that's healthy. So let me know your own opinions down below. And hey, why not leave an idea for what you think would make a fun new weapon addition for Monster Hunter 6 while you're at it. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.